Hello, hello. Welcome to the webinar. So we are going to dive in just a minute. So hang tight for just a second while everybody gets on and gets going. So quick housekeeping reminder that if you have Google Drive, Spotify, Netflix, or any of those streaming apps going, turn them off so that you don't have anything else that sucks your bandwidth. You want to have the maximum available bandwidth in order to maintain the picture and the sound. If for any reason you get disconnected, log off and log back in, and we'll still be here. If my internet gets interrupted, I've got a backup system here in the studio now, so I can quickly bop onto another Wi-Fi channel if I need to. So we should be good to go. If you know you have a question that you want to ask, go ahead and type it into the chat roll. I've got great questions from y'all gotten over the past week about working in a series. So hopefully I'm going to be able to answer all of those today. But it's super important, I think, to cover this topic. And it's one that I want you all to think about really beginning to put into practice in your studio practice. So we're going to dive right on in. Our topic of discussion today is 5 steps to creating a series of artworks, whether you're talking about painting, sculpture, ceramics, fibers, mixed media, whatever your medium, you can work in a series. And there are a number of reasons why you should think about doing that. In fact, I think that was one of the questions that came up several times during that list of questions that y'all gave to me was, you know, what benefit is there to working in a series? In fact, what is a series? So actually, I should back up and cover that before we go to why do it. What is it? So the what. A series is a collection of related works. That's it. That's the definition I used when I was teaching seniors how to do this at the college. And it is the definition that most art critics use and most professional painters, professional artists. So it's just a collection of related works. You get to define how they are related. So how tightly they're related or how widely they're related. A lot of that is completely up to you. So that's the what it is. Then why do it? There are a number of reasons. The first one is that it will radically improve your skills if you start working in a series. So when you're working in a series, you focus very tightly in on a theme or a subject. And when you do that, your knowledge and understanding of that subject becomes much greater. So focusing in on a theme like that, focusing in on a collection, will help develop your physical skills in whatever your field in art is. That's the first benefit. Second one, and I think really this is the one that's talked about the most, is that you will become more memorable to collectors and gallerists. So when you work in a series, your work becomes more recognizable. It becomes more memorable. People begin to associate you, the artist, with a body of work. And when you do that, it is much easier to begin to build those followers who become collectors. So it's very important to develop a consistent body of work if you have any ambitions to get into a gallery or to build your own body of collectors. People want to know that there's consistency to what you're doing. And creating and working in a series with a signature style, which is the next thing, is something that reassures collectors and gallerists alike. Gallery owners want to know that if they take you on and they start promoting your work, you're going to be able to supply them with a consistent stream of work. So that consistency is super important to gallerists and collectors alike. Last but not least, and I think really this is, to me, the most important one, is that when you work in a series, it provides you a focus that puts you in a state of flow. That means that you effortlessly go from one painting to the other. You very rarely will find yourself not knowing what to paint. You know, that air quote kind of situation where people just are stuck and they don't know what to do next. If you're working in a series or you're working on related images, you have an idea and a roadmap of where to go. So you don't have that awful situation or that sinking feeling where you just don't know what to do next. You're not sure what you want to paint. So in fact, what happens is that it opens up new possibilities and opportunities. So working in a series, far from being confining, actually opens up possibilities. So those are the reasons why I think it's important to work in a series. And now I want to talk about how to do it. How do you go about creating a series? So 5 steps. And I have a handout for y'all to collect afterwards that I'm going to post with the replay. So some of this will be in there, so you don't have to write down every single thing, but I'll reiterate those 5 steps for you several times. The first is to find a theme. So when people talk about creating a series, usually the most loose definition of that is a body of work around the same theme. So the theme could be dramatic lighting. The theme could be landscapes describing rivers. The theme could be still life paintings of pears. The theme could be good versus evil. The theme could be the political situation of the European Union. It could be anything, but it is a focus that says, I'm going to work on this and not all of this other stuff out here. So when you have a focus and you narrow things down, you get more done. So the first step is to pick a theme. Now, you don't want to overthink this because I see all of your wheels turning. And this is actually another group of questions that were in the comments. Was around, is it subject matter? Is it style? It's any of those things. So, but when you pick a theme, it can be the subject matter. It can be the style that you do it in. It can be the overarching concept, you know, right versus wrong, good versus evil, light versus dark. It can be any of those things. You get to decide. So last month when we focused on the cloud challenge, guess what? Most of y'all made a series of work because you were focusing on clouds. That was a series. So thinking about it intentionally and consciously, it's a very natural follow-up on what we did and focused on last month. So pick a theme. That's step 1. Then step 2 is to research and immerse yourself in that theme. So think back to the cloud project that I did, the 31 cloud project. What I did when I first got started, what sparked the whole thing for me was that I got totally and completely fascinated by the research that I was doing for our cloud challenge in here last month. So I rekindled my love of Turner and Constable's cloud studies. I think I bought 4 Constable and Turner books last month, immersing myself in clouds. Now, not researching and taking copious notes, but filling my imagination, filling my creative well with everything I could find on clouds, including cloud TED Talks, cloud societies. Did y'all know there's a cloud society? There is, and you can join it. It has a monthly membership fee, and it's fascinating. Cloud research, why the sky is blue, why the clouds are the colors they are. So I dove deep into that. So fully immerse yourself in whatever that theme is. What happens when you do that is that you're feeding your creativity. You're feeding your imagination. We can't create from a dry well. So you need to fill that well up to the point where you just can't wait to get to the studio and get to work. So if step one was to pick a theme, step two is to research and immerse yourself in it. So I really like immersion as a word for that better than research. Research feels dry, like you're going to get out a notebook and a pencil and you're going to go to the library and then you're going to have to write a term paper afterwards. And that's not what I mean. I mean fully immerse yourself in whatever that subject is. Step number 3 is to start making sketches of any sort, shape, or form. So when I'm thinking about working in a series, I'm going to start, and it usually happens really naturally out of that immersion, I'm going to start working in my sketchbook, and I'm going to be making lots of notes and written notes as well as drawn notes in that sketchbook. That becomes sort of the outlet for all of that creative well filling. And I'll usually end up with, probably twice as many sketches as I might need for whatever I think the beginning of the series is. So those sketches need to explore composition. They need to explore value relationships. You can even begin to explore color in there. One of the things that I've been telling my students in my courses is to get a box of Crayola crayons. So some of y'all are in those courses. Get a box of crayons because crayons free up your imagination. We associate them with the good feelings of being a child, with the fun of coloring. And when we're coloring, we release all of the inhibitions that we have about color. The colors become richer and more intense. So make a lot of sketches. Explore compositions fully. That's the third step. You're beginning to take all of that deep immersion and putting it into visual form. Then the fourth step is to set some parameters. This is where you decide the answer to probably 80% of the questions that y'all had for me. This is where you decide things like subject matter, you decide size, you decide colors even. You can decide any of those things. I actually like to think of series as being a project because it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and usually has a kind of goal around it as well. And the project might become much bigger if it's one that holds my attention longer, and it might stay small. Like I'm probably not going to quit painting clouds anytime soon, for example, after the cloud project. But you get to set the parameters for the project. So you get to decide how big the box is or how small the box is. But I want you to understand that there's a great deal of freedom in a box. When you have a set of parameters to work within, it means that you're free to operate inside of those parameters. That to me is almost the ultimate freedom. So set the parameters for your project or series. They do not all have to be the same size. You get to decide that. For example, in my 31 clouds, they're not all the same size. They range from 4 by 6 inches to some of them, one was 9 by 12, and I've got some that are bigger than that. So it can be a range of different sizes. Usually when you're first starting out working in a series, it's a little easier if they are the same size, but don't feel like they have to be. Christine is saying the same type of canvases. That can absolutely be a parameter. You might decide that you only want to paint on canvas for this series. You might decide they're all going to be on panel, or they could be a mixture thereof. So there really are no set guidelines on scale and on surface. You can work on whatever you decide is going to free you up. One of the things that I think is important to remember about parameters is, again, they offer you freedom. Our brains are only wired to have a certain number of decisions that we can make a day. I think, if I remember right, the number is somewhere around 200. It may be fewer or a little bit more. But we are not capable of handling more decisions than this very finite amount every day. If you burn those up thinking, well, what size am I going to work on today? Am I going to work on canvas or panel? Am I going to work on paper or panel? Am I going to work big or am I going to work small? You're burning up brain cells. It means you don't have the energy left to paint and paint freely. So you want to remove the distraction of decisions as much as you can from the process that you're working with. So that's why I recommend using as close to the same size, as close to the same surface as you can when you're first starting working on a series. But don't feel like you have to box yourself in on that. Just remove as many of the decisions from the process as possible. So that fourth thing is to set the parameters. You can set the medium, you can set the size, you can set the surface, you can even limit the colors if you want to. Now, I don't tend to do that. I tend to work with different colors in each painting. There is such a thing as too much sameness. So don't turn them all into little clones of each other, because that could potentially become boring to you and to the viewer. You want to be excited about what you're working on so that you feel excited to get into the studio each day. But decide what those parameters are. Figure that part out. Then the fifth thing that I recommend is that you set a discipline and a practice, a schedule for working in the studio. So figure out what time of day you're going to work, and I would give it really takes 90 days to set a habit, but I would give it a few weeks in order to begin to get into a routine. So you want to have a habit and a routine. Again, this goes back to decision making, so that you're not having to think about some of those things that you're doing. The more you can turn over to habit, good habits, the better. So set habits that set you up for success. So our 5 things again are, anybody remember the first one? Pick a theme. Totally pick a theme. Narrow it down. Number 2 was to immerse yourself in that theme. Number 3 is to make sketches and studies. Take your immersion and put it onto paper. Number 4 was to set the parameters, and number 5 was to set a routine. So let's think about some of the things that go into a routine. We're going to be talking about this in the painting challenge that's coming up next week. But a routine, what is a routine? Well, a routine would be the things that you normally do when you get to the studio that are habits and routines, so that you know what you're going to do and you don't have to overthink it. Especially helpful is if you include triggers that tell your brain now is the time to do that habitual thing. The more positive triggers you can include to your routine, the easier it is to get started without having to overthink about it. So one of my routines in the studio has always been, since graduate school, to make a pot of decaf coffee when I get in there. Now, I'm not doing it this summer because my air conditioner is not working quite right this summer, and it's too hot to drink coffee in here. So I'm drinking water. But normally, I would already have a pot of coffee going, because the smell of the coffee and the taste of the coffee is a trigger for me to get the creative juices flowing. So I associate that with good experiences from grad school, from sitting down in the morning and drinking coffee with my mentor, which I did every morning. So it takes me right back to that time period. So important to incorporate those triggers. Can anybody think of triggers that they use in the studio? What kind of things make you think about doing your habitual routines? One of the things that I like to do is to organize my paint tubes before I get started. Even my habit, notice what word I use, my habit of mixing the paint ahead of time becomes a trigger for flow. So mixing the paint ahead of time is kind of a transitional action between everyday world and painting world. It's very meditative, but it gets me in the mood to paint. All of those things, those habits and rituals, lead to a flow state. And flow state is something that has been explored a great deal in the past 40 or 50 years, but particularly around athletics. So in a flow state, you don't have to think about your decisions. In a flow state, one habit habitually and naturally leads to another. You are able to intuitively make decisions. It's a free-flowing, easy state of being. It's that state that happens when we lose ourselves in our painting. When suddenly you notice that 4 hours has gone by and time just disappeared. That is a characteristic of a flow state. So if you go through those routines and habits and you create discipline around the studio, ironically, it sets you free. So I want us all to work on those habits, and that's one of the things I hit on in the Daily Painting Challenge that's coming up. Now, the Daily Painting Challenge is public, and so people in, for example, the free group have to sign up to the email list in order to get those daily email prompts. Y'all don't need to do that. I'm going to have those in here in the membership, and I'll probably actually have those uploaded long before Monday, because to me it's a part of setting up that practice so that you can work on your series. My hope is that most of y'all, even if you don't do it Monday through Friday when everybody else is doing it, but most of y'all will dive in and try the 5-day challenge to kind of jumpstart yourself in coming up with ideas for your series. Because I want, by the end of the month, everybody to feel like they have a direction that's going to set them free, a way to get started and a way to create some consistent work. A lot of y'all are already doing that, but hopefully if you follow through on these suggestions, it'll actually take you to the next level. So I have run my mouth for quite a bit here, and I want to make sure that I've left enough time for questions. Anybody have any questions at all? So we've got a pile of people on here. Any questions that y'all have at all? I'm going to try to carefully pull up the membership and pull up y'all's questions without losing or taking up too much internet with that, so that I can make sure I've covered everything that everybody put in there. So let me get that. Here we go. So Candace had a great question, and this is something I didn't talk about yet, and that's a reasonable number of pieces. It depends on what you're trying to do, what kind of project you're working on, but in general, 5 to 7 pieces is a good place to get started. And if it depends on what your goal is. If you're just trying to do it for yourself, if you're trying to get some more consistency in your work, I would start with 5 to 7 pieces. And then I would expand on that. If you're trying to get work into a gallery, or getting work up to a website in order to build a collector base, I would say closer to 20, 12 to 20, 15 to 20, somewhere along in there. Again, collectors and gallerists want to know that you have a consistent body of work, that you're going to be able to produce similar quality and similar types of work on a consistent basis. So just for yourself, 5 to 7. For external use, I would say closer to 12 to 20, something like that. Mike has a great question here. He said, when should they be done? Different times of the same day, within the week, month, different seasons? Part of that, this is almost a 3-part question, because that sparked some ideas in my head, Mike, when I first read it. One is, Monet worked in a series almost always, and he would go back to the same exact subject over and over again at different times of day. And so the changes in the paintings have to do with the changes in the color of the light hitting the surfaces. I do much the same thing. I go back to the same places at different times of day, different seasons, different weather, and that affects the colors and the patterns of values in what I'm painting. So that's one answer to it is, yes, do different times of day if you're painting the same subject and you want to record changes in light and color. When you're working on a series, in this sense, working at the same time of day or having that consistent discipline around, say, I'm going to work in the mornings or I'm going to work in the afternoon. Depends on what your personal flow is. So for me, I like to get out in the morning. So I go out to the country in the morning. I work with the horse in the morning or feed the horse in the morning, and then come to the studio in the afternoon. So I like to get my out and about and exercise in the morning, and then come to the studio anywhere between 11 and 1 o'clock and stay until about 6. So you have to figure out what your best sort of flow and time frame is. Other people are happiest in the studio first thing in the morning. It just depends. So that was the second aspect of time that I thought was important, that kind of got tipped off by your question. Another one is the number of things that you work on at one time. So I also recommend when you're working in a series, this really could be number 6, is to work on more than one piece at a time. So I don't think when you're working in a series that it tends to hold together well if you do one in January and you don't do the second piece until September, because you're in a whole different mindset, mind frame, and mood and level of interest when it's like 9 months apart. So I think they need to be done fairly closely together. And it truly does work better when you're working on larger paintings or larger artworks, period, to work on more than one piece at a time. It keeps them from being precious, and preciousness is the enemy of good art. So if you can work on more than one piece at a time, you'll be a lot better off. So great question there, Mike. Deb says, should a series of spring or summer flowers be up for sale during just those seasons, for example, or however it pertains to your series? That's a great question. I do think that collectors look for certain subjects in very seasonal ways at times, but I've had people buy paintings of the snow, which I don't do very often because it doesn't snow here very often, in the middle of the summer. So it just depends. I think you could certainly create a desire for spring and summer when it's in the middle of the winter. So I don't think you should let yourself be boxed in by the time of year as far as the subjects of your paintings go. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. I think you could, instead of looking at it as a negative, I would look at that as a potential marketing opportunity. So if you've got something that's more seasonal in subject matter, you can position that as the answer to the current situation that people are in. For example, pictures of spring in the middle of winter. Or you can position it as a depiction of what the current situation is. Then Deb says, how do you find inspiration for a series of any kind? I immerse myself. So that goes back to step number 2. That immersion step is super important. It is what makes you fall in love with what you're working on. And if you fall in love with what you're working on, everybody else will fall in love with it as well. That kind of feeling and passion is contagious. So finding inspiration for me comes from immersion. Sometimes it's not there to begin with. So when I first started doing daily painting 6-8 years ago, longer than that, 8 years ago, I started doing it because I was frustrated. So the inspiration was frustration. And I thought if I set up this project with these very strict guidelines, I had super strict guidelines on that series. Part of it was I was feeling very uninspired. So a lot of times inspiration comes from perspiration. Chuck Close said almost that same thing. So don't wait around for inspiration. Set some parameters and you'll fall in love with it while you're working on it. Not always, but most of the time. So inspiration comes from that immersion. And you can immerse yourself ahead of time if something's intrigued you, or immerse yourself in the project while you're working on it, and you'll become inspired. Don't wait around for it, though. What factors come into play besides me and my inner critic? I think our inner critic can really shut us down. And I'm going to be talking about that a lot next week. So like I said, y'all are going to get the prompts and the videos for the Daily Painting Challenge in here. You don't need to go over to the free group. And one of the things that I like to talk about in there is the fear of failure and how to let that go. When you're working within a set of discipline, routines, and habits, you'll find fear of failure disappearing because things become less precious because you're doing more of it. And when you do that, it's a huge release. It's a huge release. Gwen says, I'm planning a series on the Vermilion Cliffs. Biggest questions, where do I show it? Ooh. Now, I'm not that familiar with the Vermilion Cliffs, Gwen, but my first initial response is that I'm guessing that's a national park or a national designated area, if not maybe a state one. I would position that accordingly. I would see if you can, if they have a visitor center, I would see if you could exhibit them in the visitor center. A lot of the national parks have those kind of programs. A lot of state parks do as well. That would be the first place I'd want to do it. And I would figure out how to partner with that park so that you build a relationship. Most of the state parks and national parks have foundations or nonprofit groups that help support them. You could partner with that group. You could donate a percentage of the sales from that series to the foundation to support the park. So that's what I would go with first. So I would look at how you could possibly exhibit them at the site. If they have some sort of visitor center, I think that would be great. And the size, I think you could have variety to the size. I think framing I'm pretty picky about. I like to frame the same way when I'm working on a series. I like to have the framing be consistent across the whole thing. I tend to not vary very much at all when I'm framing my work for exhibitions. They tend to all be studio neutral frames. So be real consistent in framing. Can I offer small studies as well? Oh, absolutely. I think that's a really important part. When you're exhibiting, I think it helps the viewer understand your process when they can see studies, when they can see sketches. And I would look at what you're talking about doing as a chance to educate and inform, not only about your work, but about the spot itself. So yeah, I would include studies, and I would include smaller pieces in almost any exhibition. And I would include it in sharing the work in general on your website. Don't feel like it has to just be the finished pieces, the bigger pieces. Caroline says, should the titles reflect the theme of the series? I tend to not be particularly poetic with my titles. Part of that, it's actually kind of ironic when I think about it, because I am a writer too, but I don't want my titles to overwhelm the artworks. I want the titles to maybe help inform a little bit, but not become super important. Just like I don't want my signature to overwhelm the composition. So there's no hard and fast rule about that. So she says, I gave each painting in a sunflower series titles from Broadway. I think that helps in the sense of there's probably a reason that you were drawn to that. And it was probably in the back of your mind while you were painting them. So I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that at all. And it also freed you up from having to think about the titles too much. So I think that sounds like a good plan. She says, can the hues vary distinctly, leaving the subject matter to carry the theme? Absolutely. Like I said earlier, you do not have to be married to just a certain size or just a certain set of colors or even a certain set of subjects, as long as they're around the same theme. Then she says, I like framing to enhance a painting, but the frames in a series be chosen to enhance the series as a whole. Yeah, they need to be kind of consistent. Marianne's question is, where do I start? Well, where you start is picking that theme, and don't overthink it. So go through those 5 steps, Marianne, and you'll get started. So step number 1, pick a theme. Step number 2, immerse yourself in your subject, in your theme. Step number 3 is to make those sketches. Step number 4 is to set your parameters. And step number 5 is to set up your discipline and your routine. So go through those in order, and you'll be able to get started there. Remember, when you're working this way, you might feel a little limited. Don't let yourself feel that way. You can have more than one series that you're working on at a time. Just because, for example, say you decide to work on landscapes, that doesn't mean you're never going to paint a portrait again. It means that you're not painting a portrait for this series. So let go of some things in order to focus deeply on other things. The main thing is that deep focus. Roz says, how do you know you want to do multiple paintings on the same theme before you've actually done one? I usually find that the theme for a project grows out of what I've just done. So if you're not sure what to work on with for your theme, what I usually tell people to do is to get all of their favorite paintings that they've got in the home or the studio, get them out and lean them against a wall so that you can look at them all at one time. Get your favorite beverage, coffee, if that's a trigger for you like it is for me, or tea, or if it's past 5 o'clock in the evening, get yourself a glass of wine. Look at the paintings. What similarities do you see there? Are there any recurring themes in there already? Is there some particular painting that stands out as the one that just floats your boat and you want to do more of those? That's how you pick a theme to get started. Or you can randomly pick a theme, which is what I did when I was starting the daily paintings. There's less randomness to it than there appeared at the time, but I pretty much just went plop, this is what I'm going to do. So I decided then that I was going to paint what I could see from the edge of the road between my house and the farm where I keep my horse. That was it. That was the parameter for the subject matter. Once I made that decision, then that stuck. I was making a commitment to it for 3 months because I did 90 days. So pick something, it almost doesn't matter what, and stick to it. It could be pears. I love painting pears. So it could be fruit. I can't think of her name right now. There was a woman who painted a bowl, the same exact bowl, every day for a month, for 30 days. Each one is really different. They are exquisitely beautiful. It's a very meditative project. So if you're not sure, pick one thing and try doing 3 of them to get started. Then see where that leads you. Remember, it's an adventure. Think of it as a journey and an adventure, not a hard problem. Then Ross says, what if that one painting satisfies your curiosity or says everything that you wanted to say? Occasionally that will happen, but usually the painting also asks another question. So it might say everything it has to say about blue bowls, but what about red bowls? What about white bowls? And it leads to something else. Are all paintings you do about the same subject a series by definition? They could be considered that. There's certainly a collection of related works. So yes, in that sense, they are. I think people overthink the idea of a series. So if you pick, for example, I've seen you do landscapes. In fact, your cloud painting that you posted earlier is a landscape. So if you have 5 paintings of the ocean, that becomes a series or a collection of related works. So it can be that loose. Christine says, I should know this, but is a series off the same subject? Doesn't have to be. It could be the way that you're treating the values. It could be simply around a philosophical idea. So you could be creating a series around stark contrasts of light and dark. That could be your theme. And those pieces could be still life, landscape, portrait, but you're treating the subjects in all the same way. So the answer is, what makes a good series? The answer is one that has a certain amount of consistency from painting to painting. If it's all over the place and looks like 4 different people did it, that's not going to hang together as a series. So that's what makes the series work, is when it looks like it was done by the same person and you can identify some related issues in each painting. So you can take as many liberties as you want to. Laura says, let's see, a lot of these I've answered already. Brenda has a good one here. Looking at a photo to paint, can you tell us how to decide on colors to use? Now that's not really a series question, but I want you to think about it. That's just a general painting question, but you can think about it in terms of a series. It depends on what your goal is. So if you want to create a series around observational painting where you are recording what your eye sees, and you're going to be very strictly observational, then the colors that you choose to use need to be what your eyeball sees, not what you're making up in your head, but exactly what you see. If you want to be interpretive and expressive in your paintings, then you might choose colors that make you feel a certain way. So I would back it up to what your theme is in order to decide what colors to use. Now, as an observational painter, I tend to paint the colors I see, and I might exaggerate them a little bit, but I'm painting what I see. Not everybody paints that way, and that's perfectly okay. And Tamara had a really good point here. She has been in my course, the Composition, Color, and Light, and she points out that back in the first module of that, we explored lots of different compositions from one photo. That could easily become a series. So if you take one photograph and you try to come up with 8 different compositions from that photograph, bam, you have a series, because the subject is the same, but you've just altered the viewpoint or the composition so that you're getting a wide range there. So absolutely, that could be a good one. Doesn't have to be that tight, but it can be. So that's a great way to get started. And Sylvie asks about different media. I don't really have a problem with series being in a different media. that begins to stretch it a little bit for some people, but I don't think it really does, because you can explore the same theme in oils, acrylics, pastels, watercolor. I have a friend who's a quite good painter who explores the same theme in his paintings and in his sculptures. So he is primarily an oil painter, makes wonderful paintings, and then he makes sculptures that are whimsically hilarious, just like his paintings. Actually, I have two friends that do that are both sculptors and painters. And their work hangs together as a very much related body of work because the themes are the same, the subject matter is the same, their approach to color and composition remains the same across a wide range of mediums. So, yes, you can split between different mediums. Patricia says, is it still considered a series if you occasionally paint the same thing but do it over a period of years? Yeah, I think it can be. I don't think, if you look at my work, for example, over the last 10 years, it's really a series. Now the series has shifted and changed, and it's had a focus over here and then a focus over there, but there's been a real strong consistency there. Before that, I was painting around a different theme. And when you look at the paintings I did 20 years ago and the paintings I did 10 years ago, you can see where there's a big change and I went in a different direction. There's still some similarity between what I was working on, but I did make some strong changes. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So yeah, you can consider it a series, a bigger, broader series when it happens over several years. But for our purposes this month, I want you to think about coming up with 3 to 5 painting ideas by the end of the month that are related in some way. And I want you to go through those 5 steps. And then I really would strongly recommend that you do the painting challenge next week as a way to jumpstart it. So the painting challenge, we have 5 days and do a 20-minute painting each day. If you're a sculptor or working in another medium besides painting, then do 5 studies, 1 a day. Do 5 drawings a day. The idea is to get some consistent practice going, but also to generate some ideas, figure out how to work in flow, develop a practice, and let go of the perfectionism. So if you do that and you have 5 20-minute paintings, think of those as studies for a series of work. So we'll walk through the steps as a group on how to do that. So the public challenge is really focusing on getting in flow and on mindset, but we're going to walk through all of those steps. I'm going to talk about picking out subject matter. I'm going to talk about tools and materials. So I'll be on live on my Facebook page next week every day. I'll probably be going live a good bit towards the end of this week as well. So those will be posted into the membership so that y'all can come back and look at those. But start it off by just picking a theme really loosely. If you're not sure of what kind of theme to pick, we'll post some suggested ones in the group. And I want you to come back later this afternoon and download the freebie for the challenge so that you can look at those steps, because it outlines pretty much the same steps that we've covered in here. I think I've gotten all the questions that were in the membership, and let me double check and see about the ones that came in here. Oh, Patricia, thank you so much. We're good. Patricia is asking about the coming storm. Christine is evacuating. You should be on the road, Christine. You shouldn't be listening to webinars. You need to be out of there, or maybe you're already up here. They're evacuating the coast. I'm a good ways away from the coast, so we're probably fine. And it looks like the storm is turning and heading north. It's heading to North Carolina, to somewhere between Wilmington and Hatteras. We're going to get some rain and probably no more than a breeze here in Columbia. Praying for them, but thankful it's moving off. I think it has a good chance of just turning out to sea, and I'm hoping that's what's going to happen. Barbie says, when I had a contract with a print publisher, they were more interested in market colors than subjects or seasons. I guess it depends on your painting goals. It totally depends on your painting goals. Publishers tend to, they also go after subjects too. I'm working with mine right now, and yeah, they look for themes, and some of them want particular colors because they're working with designers and they're after the color and the, oh, I'm gonna sneeze, the design of the year. Excuse me. I would not worry about the market so much as it being something you're passionate about, because if you're passionate about it, that will come through in the paintings, and then that begins to, depending on how you market it, that begins to attract a market and a following. But identifying those goals first is a biggie. We're going to talk about that more this afternoon, Barbie. Yes, 2 series at a time. I don't think that's a big problem, Christine, but don't go more than that. Probably would recommend, if you haven't done a series before, to stick with 1 to begin with. Jane says, would Here and There be considered a travel series? As a title, yeah. I'm not, you'd have to give me a little bit more info on that to let me know exactly what you're talking about. Candy says, if I do still lives with ceramic pots or vases, is that a series? Yeah, it is. Now, you don't have to narrow it down to Southwestern or anything like that. You could do it'd be a series if you just are focusing on pots and vases. They don't even have to all be ceramic. So don't feel like you have to narrow it down too much. Christine, it's time to leave. The traffic is already horrible. Get out of there. So I'm going to have to hop off now because we have another webinar coming up. But take care, everyone. Let me know your questions and comments over in the membership, and can't wait to dive in further. I'm working in a series with y'all. Bye-bye for now. Happy painting, everybody.